What is the filtrate made up of? Again, we see that we've filtered the contents of the blood through the filtration membrane. Now remember that filtration membrane was made up of the fenestrated epithelial or endothelial cells, the basement membrane, and then the filtration slits of the pedicels from the podocytes. Okay, now what is actually in the filtrate? Well, obviously, since it's from blood and blood is mostly water, water is going to be a major part of it. And of course, filtrate and urine are both primarily water also. And we have to adjust how much water, but we'll talk about that later. Well, what else is in the blood? What's able to go through the filtration membrane? Well, all these ions are small enough to be able to go through that, and they have the right charge to go through that. So we're going to lose sodium, potassium, and chloride, but we can't necessarily afford to lose all of our sodium, potassium, and chloride. So we're going to have to reclaim most of it or a lot of it through our reabsorption. Okay, now, what else is small enough to actually leave and get into the filtrate? Well, our organic molecules such as glucose or our amino acids. So glucose does naturally leave. It is small enough to leave, but obviously we don't want to find glucose in our urine. So this is another thing that's reclaimed in that proximal convoluted tubule. Matter of fact, all of our organic molecules, the glucose, the amino acids, are reclaimed through reabsorption in the proximal convoluted tubule because of the great surface area of the brush border cells and the nature of the transport going on here. Now, so glucose, amino acids, of course we shouldn't be able to lose big proteins through the filtration membrane, but the building blocks of the proteins, the amino acids, we certainly could lose and we certainly want to reclaim. All right, but what are we really trying to get rid of from the blood and get it out of our bodies is our nitrogenous wastes, these byproducts of the breakdown of our proteins within our cells. And of course, this is waste being produced from the cells that the blood is reabsorbed. Now we're going to get it from the blood to the rest of our body. So urea, uric acid, creatinine are these things that we literally are trying to get rid of. So we're going to get rid of these and not reabsorb them. If we do find protein in our urine, which it shouldn't be there, then that could be a condition called proteinuria, and basically something has damaged the glomerulus. Maybe not every one of them, but it's certainly damaged some of them at the point to where we're literally allowing protein to escape. Now, remember, one thing that actually happens in inflammation is that we do get increased permeability of the capillaries, and so therefore we would get an increase in filtration, and larger things might be able to actually, leave the blood if that was the case. So sometimes we have to be careful about inflammation, because inflammation could lead to losing proteins. But in a normal situation without inflammation and with just normal filtration, we shouldn't find protein in our urine. Another thing we could potentially find in urine that we shouldn't find in urine is the presence of blood cells. So again, blood cells, the red blood cells shouldn't be in our urine. So we could potentially have now there could be a urinary tract infection or a bladder infection or something like that. But as far as finding, one of the things we'd have to rule out is a condition called hematuria, where we actually, because of damage to the glomerulus, we would have red blood cells that would be in our filtrate. So again, something else that would be an indicator of damage to the glomerulus, even though, again, blood in the urine could be from something else. This is certainly one of the conditions we would have to check on. Now, the next thing is, we got this specialized capillary called the glomerulus, and we have blood flowing in here. So what is it that actually causes blood, the contents of blood to be pushed out through the filtration membrane? And the first thing we want to look at is our hydrostatic, or our blood pressure. In other words, the force of the blood coming in here, the force of that fluid coming in here, and notice that looking at this picture here, we see that we can actually measure the force of that fluid, and that's going to be 60 millimeters of mercury. Now, if that hydrostatic pressure was 60 millimeters of mercury on a normal capillary, it would literally burst the capillary open. That'd be way too much pressure. But because we have this, the structure with the podocytes on the outside and the basement membrane endothelial cells, then we can handle this this pressure. And also part of what we have is the fact that we have this more narrow efferent arteriole and the bigger diameter of the afferent arteriole. So more blood is coming in here, less blood is leaving, and I've got a pressure of 60 millimeters of mercury to push the contents of that blood through that filtration membrane into the capsule to form that filtrate. Well, with that high hydrostatic pressure, which is pretty high, why do we need it that high? Well, one reason is because we actually have some pressures opposing the hydrostatic pressure, and there is actually a hydrostatic pressure of the filtrate itself opposing the new hydrostatic pressure of pushing blood through the membrane. So I've got this really, fairly high hydrostatic pressure of 60 millimeters, but I'm not pushing it into an empty space. I'm pushing it into a space that has its own pressure, just even due to the fact that it's there, even though the fluid is going to run through the tubule. So I'm opposing the pressure coming out with 15 millimeters of mercury, and it's kind of like if you took a squirt gun and you squirted it out into the air, then it would have a certain amount of pressure and coming into the air. But if I took that same squirt gun and I squirted it underwater where water already existed, I would have water resisting the water that would be leaving my squirt gun. But as long as the pressure of the water leaving my squirt gun was greater than the pressure of the water opposing it, then it's still going to come out. Okay, now not only do I have a hydrostatic pressure that's opposing it, I have an osmotic pressure that's also opposing it. And of course what that means is that because there's more non-water particles in here and more water out here, water will want to try to run back in. So here's the movement of water, which is osmosis, of course, and we can actually measure that. Now, so I've got two forces of pressure opposing this. So if I add these up, 28 and 15 is 43, and so 43 is less than 60. So as long as this pressure is greater than that, then fluid is going to leave. Now, if this pressure dropped to 43 instead of being greater than that, then that means that that no, we couldn't filtrate anymore. And if I can't filtrate, I'm not going to get my, all those toxins out of my blood. Therefore, my kidneys would fail. So if I fail to have this hydrostatic pressure of 60 millimeters of mercury pushing that blood through here and filtrating it, if I fail to have 60, then I am going to, especially if I were down to 43 or even less than 60, means I'm going to filter less blood. If I get too much higher than 60, I might start damaging my filtration membrane. So 60 is the ideal, but we have to have ways of maintaining that as we try to overcome these two pressures. So again, looking at our numbers here, I've got a pressure gradient of 60 millimeters of mercury of my hydrostatic pressure pushing the fluid out. I have two pressures opposing it. I have the hydrostatic pressure of the fluid that's already in the capsule, and then I have the osmotic fluid. If I add up those two different fluids, then that makes 43. And then if I say, well, what's the difference in, my 60 millimeters of mercury, my 43, it would be 17. So I have a net gain of pressure of 17 millimeters of mercury, a net filtration pressure over what's opposing it. So again, if this dropped below that, then I'm not going to be able to filter as much out in over a period of time as I need to get rid of the to make the urine that needs to take the wastes away from my body. Okay, so we got to push a certain amount of fluid out of here because what we're going for is our GFR, or glomerular filtration rate, which we like to maintain it about 125 milliliters per minute, and we wouldn't be able to if that pressure changed too significantly over a period of time. So again, our goal is to reach about 125 milliliters per minute of what's filtrated from our glomerulus. To maintain this GFR of 125, we need to make adjustments. So there's an auto-regulation of adjusting when our blood pressure rises or falls. Because if our blood pressure is about 120, over 80, and that's what helps maintain this hydrostatic pressure of about 60. But of course, we're going to get a net gain of about 17 because we have the two pressures opposing it. But when we exercise, we know our pressure is going to go up. And when we relax, we know that our pressure can fall down. So how do we maintain this average pressure? What does our body do to adjust this? Because again, if we have too high a pressure, we can push out too much. If we have too low a pressure, we may not filter out enough. So how does our body regulate that? Okay, so again, if we have a normal blood pressure of 120 over 80, 120 millimeters of mercury, our systemic, remember that systemic pressure, then our glomerular hydrostatic pressure is normal, and our diameter of our afferent arteriole is larger, is a certain size, which is always larger in the normal situation than the efferent arteriole. And of course, that reaches our goal of our 125 millimeters per minute, our glomerular filtration rate being that. Now, when we're exercising or doing something that raises that systemic pressure from 120 to say 140, then our afferent arteriole remains normal, but our net filtration rate is going to be increased because we're increasing the pressure of the hydrostatic pressure that's pushing that through there. So our GFR is going to then increase. We can see that our GFR increased from 120 milliliters to 146.
Severe dehydration.
And as that just interrupted me and said, it would quickly cause severe dehydration if we maintain that. Now, we can handle that for small periods of time, but we couldn't maintain 146 over 120 because then we would be losing a lot more urine. We would get severely dehydrated and even to the point where it could potentially cause death. So how does our body adjust that? How does our body adjust it when our blood pressure, because we can't maintain 120, the pressure at 120 all of the time, every second of the day. So what we need to do, we need to constrict our afferent arteriole so we're not allowing so much blood to come in here, which then is going to lower our GFR back to 125 millimeters per minute. Well, what would happen if we did something like relaxing or whatever, anything that would cause our pressure to drop below 120 millimeters of mercury, and then that's going to decrease our GFR, make it lower, and therefore we would not be filtering properly. So again, our pressure went from 120 to 100. Our afferent arterial diameter remained the same, but our filtration rate dropped from 120 to 104. Well, what we're going to have to do is dilate our afferent arteriole because we went from 120 to 104. So what we're going to do is allow more blood to come in and be filtered so we can build up our filtration, our filtrate again, and increase our filtration rate. So the secret, if I've got too much, is making my afferent arteriole smaller. If I don't have enough, I need to make that afferent arteriole larger so I can increase my GFR. Notice after I've dilated it, I've got more fluid running in. Now I've increased my my GFR to 125 milliliters per minute. Now,